All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Most people coming in. I see a few people walking down the hall, getting things settled. This morning, I said on Wednesday night that we will be covering the chapter 6, verses 1 through 9 in Ephesians. So we'll be in chapter 6 of Ephesians, covering verses 1 through 9 this morning. We have this class here where we're covering 1 through 9. On Wednesday night, we're going to be covering verses 10 through 24, and that'll get us to the end of the book of Ephesians. Next Sunday morning, Stephen will be back teaching class, and we will be in the book of Colossians. So we've got this morning and Wednesday evening left in Ephesians, and then again we'll be starting in Colossians on Sunday morning next week, just to give you an idea of where we're at. This morning, again, we're in Ephesians chapter 6. We're reading from verses 1 through 9. I'm just going to go ahead and read. Actually, I'm going to read just 1 through 4 to start because there's two different things that we're discussing here in Ephesians chapter 6. So we're going to start in verse 1 and read through verse 4. It reads, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Okay, so we get some basic principles here in chapter 6 for the roles of children and parents in that relationship. We just discussed last Wednesday night about the husband and wife and their roles in relation to how the church and Christ, that relationship is parallel. And now we're going to be discussing children and parents. And then the later part of this class will be going over slaves and masters, servants and masters. So we're seeing this example of these different relationships and different common things that and when we talk about slaves and masters, again, we will talk about that when we get there, but that more applies now to employee, employer, that sort of relationship that we all are very familiar with today. But all of these are different relationships and situations which are very common, and we're getting instruction here from Paul in Ephesians about how each side of that relationship is supposed to function and the role that it fills. So here we're talking about children and parents. If I can make this work, turning it on would help. All right, so children and parents. This concept, or the concept laid out in Ephesians 5:21, continues in the child-parent relationship. Again, this continuation of this concept that we saw first there with when we were comparing Christ and the church, husbands and wives, now children and parents. I'm just going to read Ephesians 5:21. It's probably really close to where you're already at from what we just read. Ephesians 5:21 says, "Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ." Getting this idea of submitting to one another. We often think about the children submitting to the parents. We understand that children are supposed to submit and obey their parents, listen to their parents, follow their parents' instruction. But there is also the role of the parents submitting to the children. And what I mean by that is by understanding the disposition, or maybe a different way to put that would be personality of the child, because every child has a different personality. I say that as a father who has a 4-year-old and not even a 1-year-old. So I don't know that much about parenting compared to many of you in this room, obviously. I'm learning every day. But I think we all understand that every child's different. Every child has a different disposition or personality. And that requires us to instruct and raise them in specific ways or different ways. There's no one-size-fits-all way to raise children in order to raise them up in the correct way. So parents understanding that personality and the needs of their child so they will not provoke them to wrath, which we will get to shortly. So both sides of that relationship, there is a call, or there's a command to submit and to understand in both sides of that. So we see there, starting with children, children obey your parents. This is not limited to a certain age of the child, but it lasts until the child leaves and or forms their own family. Obviously, when a child eventually grows up and gets married, well, you leave and cleave, and that's a different situation. But until Or when that child leaves the house, that becomes a different situation. But especially when the child is under the parent's umbrella, under the household of the parent, they are to obey their parents. In Matthew 19:5, it says, "And said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother to hold fast, and the two shall become one flesh." So that would be an example of when you're out from under that children obey your parents' command when you leave and cleave to your spouse. Again, Tom I haven't mentioned, but Tom, as usual, has the mic if anybody has any comments. Bud.
You may be going to mention this later, I don't know, but when you talk about your children, if you have two or more, each child is different. So you're always learning. You may think you get to a comfortable place, and then all of a sudden the next one comes along and it's a whole different ball game. So parents have to continually think about the needs of each child because they are different. And they get more different as they get older. You'll find that out.
I can only imagine. You're right, though. We're always learning as parents, just like we're always learning in every aspect of our lives. If you're not learning, then you're probably not growing in some way. We're always looking to learn more about our relationship with God, about His Word, or about whatever job we work, or any of those things. The idea that there's always something to learn is a good mindset to have. It helps us grow. Moving on. Teaching children obedience and discipline is vital for their future ability to function properly in the world. We don't need to go down we could go down a rabbit hole about just the way kids are today in school. If you teach in schools, have been around schools, if you've subbed in a school, or just, read news articles about how things are in schools, it's probably very different from what a lot of you remember from your time in school. It's different from what I remember in school, and I'm only 33, and that wasn't that long ago, but it's a lot different now. The amount of, as a fifth grade teacher, the amount of just disrespect and lack of discipline, it's the amount of things we have to put up with, it's pretty unbelievable. And that obviously has to do with the children, but a lot of that had to do with the parents that raised them to begin with. And so this is something that is important. Like I said, we could go down a rabbit hole, but we understand as Christians there's a proper way through God's Word to raise our children so that they don't become those kids that I'm talking about that we see every day. So if you teach the children to obey at home, if you teach your children to obey at home, they will eventually, hopefully, if you teach them right and follow what God's Word says, they'll obey the law of the land. Again, parents that aren't teaching their kids at home, generally, those kids end up growing up and committing serious crimes and serious, doing serious things when they get older and not obeying the law of the land. Raise them right at home, they will eventually grow up and act appropriately in society. And obey at home and obey the law of God. So if you teach them to obey at home through God's Word, you're also teaching them to obey the law of God. Those things correspond or translate. And you see in verse 1 there it says, in the Lord. So as we're raising children, you're raising them in accordance with God's will. Out of reverence for Christ, we go back to verse 21 in Ephesians chapter 5 when it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And the only reason for refusing to obey is a command that goes against God's law. We understand that it's the same thing as the husband-wife relationship. If the husband asks the wife to do something or tells the wife to do something that goes against God's law, well, that would be a reason for the wife to not do that, not to submit to that. But the same would be for children and parents. Obviously, if you have an 8 or 9-year-old at home and I could think of a bunch of examples, but this is the easiest one. For whatever reason, this wouldn't happen to any of us in here, I wouldn't think, but somebody would say, well, you don't need to go to worship this morning because you got to do this or that. Just something like that. Or even a little bit older, well, that child doesn't really have much of an option, right? When they're that age, they can't get in a car and drive here. But as they get older, as you're still under your parents' guidance and under their household, if there is an opportunity, or if as a parent is telling the child to do something that goes against God's law, that would be the only reason to refuse to obey. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 37 through 39, it says, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Again, God's law being supreme over all. Moving on. We see, "For this is right," there in the end of that verse. For this is right. If children are left to do what they think is right, they'll make poor choices because they haven't fully developed their brains. We haven't fully taught them how to be. Obviously, the younger they get, you definitely can't leave them, or the younger they are, you definitely can't leave them to make their own choices because they will not make the right choice most of the time. In Proverbs chapter 30, verses 11 through 12, Proverbs 30, 11 through 12, it says, "There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. There are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth." If we raise children the way it says here and the way we find in other passages, we're raising them under God's law. That's the right way. That's what we're talking about for "this is right," versus them not understanding what is right and letting them to their own devices. When we see in verse 2, it says honor. Honor, again, this is kind of like I've done in some other classes. You could attribute some different definitions to honor if you looked up honor, but I put to hold in awe, to value at a high price. That's the attitude a child should have towards their parents. We see in verse 2 it says honor your father and mother, which you've heard many times. That means to hold in awe, to place it in a higher tier, value at a high price. We obey, or we teach children to obey parents. That's an action regardless of an attitude. So you can obey, you can teach a child to obey, and they may not have the right attitude, but they still obey. They might be mad at you, but they're still going to do what you say. They're obeying. That's different than, or there's a continuation of that would be to honor, which is an action based on an attitude. So the attitude being that they want to hold in awe, they value at a high price, they value their parents, they honor their parents, and therefore they're going to act in a way according to that honor. If the attitude is right, if the attitude of the children is right, that correct action will follow. And I understand too, when kids are younger, that they're going to have problems and tantrums. I'm thinking about tantrums because that's what I'm dealing with right now, and with a 4-year-old. But even as they get a little bit older, that's a different situation than when they become middle school, high school aged, and they really can understand more this idea of honoring their parents and having the right attitude and behaving the way that they should. Cynthia.
This is for those who are raising younger ones, if yours are grown. But children crave structure and the discipline. If they know it, they're not going to admit it, and some of them don't know it until they're older. I've been doing some tutoring online, and I have an adult learner. He's 70, dropped out in 9th grade, and there were a lot of reasons for it, but he says, if I'd been encouraged to stay, I would have stayed. And so it is a battle to get a child up on any morning.
Yes.
Any morning, or to whatever it is. And as they get older, it just gets harder and harder in most ways. But, hold fast to that and stay disciplined and on them. And eventually, it may take a while, but eventually they're going to be thankful you did.
Consistency.
I always tell them, you'll thank me later.
That's true. Thank you. Children obey while they are at home, and they honor their parents while they're at home, especially as they get older, like I mentioned. But that honor also carries the responsibilities that remain when they leave. And we've heard about, or we understand that as children, as we grow older and become adults, it's still our responsibility to supply for the needs of our parents as they get to an older age and maybe can't supply those needs themselves. And we have to take care of our parents in older age, and that's part of us honoring them. When you read, I don't know if you probably do as well. I see there in verse 2, it says, this is the first commandment with a promise. The first 4 commandments didn't come with a promise. I'm not going to read the entire passage. You can go back and read it in Exodus chapter 20. I put the verses up there, 1 through 12. I will read verse 12 because this is the first commandment that comes with a promise. I'll read the verse and I'll talk about that. It says, honor your father. This is verse 12 in Exodus 20. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And this promise involves quantity and quality of life by honoring your parents. So now we get into this question of what does provoke your children to wrath mean? This is, every time I see this verse, it makes me laugh because I think about I feel like this is something that maybe kids sometimes like to throw in the face of their parents. You provoked me to wrath. You told me to do something, and I didn't want to do it, and so now I'm mad at you, and you provoked me. Why did you provoke me? You're told not to do that. But that's not exactly what this verse is saying here. So, does anybody have any idea? I'll give a chance. We've had a few comments. I'll give a chance for some comments here if you have one. What does it mean, don't provoke your children to wrath? Or it says, in verse 4, do not provoke your children to anger is what it says in the ESV, or wrath you might have. Any idea? What does that mean? But
I don't want to imply that I'm the only one that ever had problems with kids. I always wondered and was curious about this particular verse, especially when you're in a situation where you're trying to discipline the child. Sometimes you can be over the fence, so to speak, in disciplining a child. I'm not saying that you don't spank a child or you don't punish a child, but that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect is that you can say to a child, no matter what they do, it isn't good enough. You're not measuring up. You don't, whatever. You can use the different words, but again, it's dealing with each child differently, and your children see that. If you're dealing differently with me than you do with my brother or my sister. So that enters into the picture. And the other part of that is bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's a command that parents have. And if you don't sit down and study and have Bible reading or stories or whatever with your children, you can't expect them to grow up and understand what they're supposed to do with respect to the Lord. That'd be my
points. I agree. Anybody else?
I'll say that raising kids, I had a hard time understanding this one until they got to be teenagers, and then realizing that when you can get into a pissing match with your teenage child, and it's very easy to kind of get into the weeds with them, and maybe say or do something out of anger towards them to get them to react to you, to kind of get that reaction that you're looking for, and you're provoking them just the same way they're provoking you.
That makes sense. Yeah, keeping control of your anger and your. I agree. Berna, did you have a comment? Okay, I agree with those things. I think even furthermore, the way I interpret it means don't do things that are going to drive your children away from God, away from the Lord. As parents, especially parents of older children that have left the house, You can do all the things that you feel like are right. You can follow God's word. You can follow His law in raising the children the best way you can possibly raise them. And at the end of the day, children have, as they become adults, have free will to choose what they want to choose. That we all have free will, right? So no matter how hard you try, that doesn't mean that it's always going to work out for your child. But I think this verse means, especially for us, don't do things. Consider your child's personality. It's what I put on the next verse, or the next point. Consider their personality. Consider the way they're being raised in order to not drive them away from the church and drive them away from the Lord. And that's a different situation for every child and every parent, and I can't give one example, but I think hopefully you understand what I mean by that. Don't provoke your children to not want to be here, to not want to be a part of the Lord's church, to not want to learn more about God and be a faithful Christian. Don't drive them away. Don't provoke them to wrath, or to be wrath, meaning to leave and not want to have anything to do with you because you provoked them to that. I think that's a deeper meaning that I get out of this verse, is being careful about how we're raising kids so that you don't drive them away. And again, that doesn't always work. It's just difficult, and every child has free choice, free will to choose as they grow older, but I think that's what we're getting to in this verse. I said this earlier, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to parenting. We all understand that there's not one way to do things. And if you try to fit one way into doing things with all your kids or any kid, it's certainly not going to work. We must actively bring them up as godly children. If we don't, we are giving the world the task of raising our children. This goes back to what I said about what kids see in school every day. If we are not, as parents, especially younger kids, as they're going through school and as they're growing up, if we are not actively raising them as children that are following God's word, teaching them God's law, raising them the way that we know we should, well, they're going to have to learn from somebody, and they're not going to learn from us. They're going to learn from what they see around them. And they see a lot of junk around them in school, and that's what they're going to follow and do. And so we have to be really careful as parents, especially as they're going, school age, growing up, that we're teaching them, actively teaching them every day the right way to be and how to follow God's word so that they can grow up the way that they should. Tim.
I've had some years in some parenting, but no means by perfect in anything that I've done, in the years that I have. But I have tried to teach, my children right from wrong and to do good over bad in general. But as I have looked back over my years and as I've studied what I've done, and I'm trying to I guess you're going to say you want to perfect it, but you can't necessarily perfect it. I see myself as a parent now different than I was when I raised Wesley or when I raised Mandy or, my older two. I've got a lot more patience over the years. Sometimes I can be bad. But what I can say is we can't turn a blind eye to the world, like you were saying, Ben, because the world teaches our kids. And if we ignore, and try to block out what our kids are learning from their tablets or from their, games that they play or this and that, or what they learn in school for that matter, if we don't know what they're learning in school and we try to turn a blind eye to that, they're going to learn it a total different way than what we need them to learn now. And from a Christian's aspect, from a worldly aspect to a Christian's aspect, and what the differences are there. I told my daughter just the other day, I don't know if y'all are familiar with roadblocks, but roadblocks in general, there's a lot of things, on there that are really bad for kids. And I was telling her, look, if you're searching things on the internet and stuff like that, you need to come to us and ask, hey, is it okay? Is it appropriate for me to search on this? Or is it appropriate for me to find out about this person or that person? And get her to react and come to us first before actually just doing it on her own. This is something that if you don't and you're not engaged in your child's life at 10 years old or earlier, even 8, that they will go about searching on their own. And then they'll know stuff that you don't necessarily want them to know yet, or that they may not need to know yet, or something that they may find out that you may be able to explain to them better than what the internet explains to them. So just bear in mind.
I think that's a great point, Tim, because as kids grow up, in my opinion, if you shield them from all the nasty parts of the world, if you don't let them experience in a way that's safe, and what I mean by that is at least know about them. If you don't let them be aware of what's around them out in the world, they're eventually going to figure out what's around them in the world. But it might be when they're older and you have less influence on them because they're either a teen about to, they're at school all day, or they may have just left the house because they're going to college, and you're not going to be there to talk to them about why that's wrong. When they're at home and they're experiencing things or they're around things, you can actively teach them as they grow up why those things aren't okay, why we don't follow God's word, why that's not following God's word, why we should look to His word for how to act. If you let all that, if you just hide them from all of those things and don't let them know, things can be difficult when they grow up, and they're going to be exposed to all of it eventually, some way or another. They're not going to be living at home forever. They're going to see it all, and you're not going to be able to tell them why it's not okay. So I think that's a really important thing, Tim. I appreciate that point. Being active in raising kids, letting them know why things aren't okay, why those are sinful things, or why those are things we don't do as Christians, so that when they get older, they don't experience it for the first time and maybe go down a different path. It's a really good point. The influence of parents extends throughout life. It's a great, segue into this idea that, the influence of us, how we raise our kids, letting them know what's right and wrong, will extend throughout life. If you teach them as they're growing up, they're going to remember it. I still remember plenty of things that my parents taught me right and wrong because they tried to teach me right and wrong, versus the kids we see every day in school that don't know right and wrong because they hadn't been taught, or the adults we see that don't know right and wrong because they were never taught as kids.
Just from my past experience, my father worked a lot. They were members of the church, but he worked a lot. And I was always a good student. My brother, younger brother, was adopted, and he had learning problems. So they treated him a lot different than they treated me, and I was the oldest. So I think they always felt like I was doing well enough in school and independent enough that they didn't have to focus on me. But because my father worked so much, we didn't do a lot of things for pleasure. And I think that's important too, to give your children a time to have fun that doesn't interfere with church responsibilities. Because there wasn't a lot of that. And I know it's a divided issue, but we didn't celebrate Christmas. So there were maybe one or two other families in our congregation that didn't celebrate either. Mm-hmm. But it's hard on children when you don't celebrate and they see everybody at school doing it and all these other children at church doing it.
Right.
So, in a way, some of those things were provoking to me as a child, even as I grew up and I saw all the things that I could not do because I wasn't allowed to, because it's not biblical.
Right.
There's a lot of things in the world that aren't biblical. And then you can't have many friends because you're exposed to all that other stuff. And they get to a point where they don't really want to associate with you because you can't do those things. So it's hard. I would say the main thing is try to have some fun with your kids every now and then, even if you take them on a small vacation, because we didn't do very many vacations. Mm-hmm. Our vacations were to go see family.
Right.
Because we didn't have to have hotels and meals out and things like that. But it was because my parents were penny pinchers, basically.
I understand.
Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate that. In Proverbs, a couple verses up here, Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." And then in chapter 13, verse 24, it says, "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." Two verses we're very familiar with that go to this point. It's easy to tell children what to do, but teaching them to obey is difficult. One of the things that I want for James and Ellie growing up, I'd rather them have their tantrums and defiance at home and come to school, come to Bible class, come to things in public and learn and obey and do what they're supposed to do because they've been taught at home. And we're teaching them at home, but that's something I hope that they do as they grow up. Telling kids what to do, but not necessarily explaining or why are we doing this or not doing this. That's one thing, and maybe they will obey. Again, obey without the right attitude. But teaching them why can be difficult, but it's important. Gwen.
And I agree with that, Ben, because being a Christian with a non-Christian husband, when my children were growing up, trying to teach them from right from wrong, and then they go to Daddy, and Daddy says, well, you can do it, and then they come back to Mom, and Mom says, no, you can't do it. And my husband, would always want to do something on Sunday morning, and I'm like, we can't do that. You know where we're going to be on Sunday morning. My in-laws used to get so upset because they would try to do dinners like at 4 and 5 o'clock in the evening, and they expect me to leave my children with them. And I'm like, that's not how it works. I didn't teach my children that way. They can eat when they get back home, and if they get hungry enough, they'll eat when they get back home. But when you have a non-Christian husband, trying to teach your children the right way is very hard.
Yep. I agree. It's a good point. Educating, training, and instructing our children in the Lord is required of us. Same things we've been saying. And Moses gives the basics for carrying this training out in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. I think it's important that we go through that really quick. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, I'll read. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart." Verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So as parents, we have a personal commitment to the truth. We read that in verse 4, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." In verse 5, with devotion, with all our heart and with all our soul and with all our might. Every bit of us, our devotion to teaching children, a personal commitment, teaching our children. And with sincerity, that it would be on our heart, that these words that you read following will be on our heart as we're teaching our children. And then us as parents with our children, talking with them. Verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children. Talk of them when you sit down and sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." So personal communication with our children talking with them, teaching them the things of God. Obviously, teaching them, talking to them is not enough if we're living the wrong way. It has to be an example. We have to be an example because more than talking to the kids, especially as they're younger, they're watching. We've all heard that and understand that. Kids are always watching. So if you're doing things that go against what God's Word says, well, they're picking up on that. So our example is just as important, if not more important, in communicating how they should act and be. And then the environment, there should be a love. Children should see a love of God throughout the house. Again, verse 9 there in Deuteronomy chapter 6. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. House should be a place of love, of Christian love, following God's word. They'll notice that, and that's how we should be raising them. Admonition, you might read that in my verse. My translation says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. If you have admonition, just Greek is nouthesia, and it just means to counsel and give instruction in correct behavior. So admonishing, raising kids in correct behavior. Okay, moving on. So I'm going to read verses 5 through 9. I am running a tiny bit behind. We might finish. If not, I think we'll be just fine to finish the very tail end of this class along with what we have on Wednesday. But we'll see where we get to. So we're reading verses 5 through 9 now. Chapter 6, verses 5 through 9 in Ephesians, it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Before we cover this section, I think it's important to note that obviously, as we all agree and understand, slavery is horrid and wrong. But I think it's important to note what I put servants and masters, because some of you might have that in your translation. Mine says slaves. Slaves, during the time that this was written, slavery looked different than what we know and understand slavery to be in America and the more modern version that we are all familiar with, the horrible things that we know about that. But it was a little bit different. Still not right, but different. So slavery in first century Rome was very different than modern slavery that was practiced in America, obviously in other places. How did one become a slave? They might have been captured in war. They might have been from an opposing country or opposing empire, I should say, and they were captured in war and became a slave. They might have been already born to enslaved parents, or they might have sold themselves because they were poor and in debt and needed to be absolved of that poverty and debt, so they sold themselves in order to fulfill that debt. Slavery was not tied to ethnicity or skin color. The Romans enslaved people throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Didn't matter. Again, you captured in war. It was not tied to ethnicity or skin color. It was any of those situations, and there was more. Some worked as cooks, physicians, teachers, etc. So obviously, in that situation, they were higher valued than what we know how slaves were treated. The more modern version we know, like in America and other places, there were more value placed on slaves in this situation back in first century Rome, but not always. There were also slaves that had situations that were horrible, especially hard labor jobs and cruel and physical punishment. So that it was not all great, obviously. There were some rough situations for slaves as well during this time. Gaining freedom was possible for them, but the point being that I think that's important for all of us here this morning, Paul is teaching Christians how to live faithfully within existing social structures. So in this situation, he's teaching the slaves and masters here in the text how to live faithfully to God within the existing social structures, their current situation in life, while planting principles that undermine slavery itself. So we all understand slavery is completely horrible and wrong, and that was understood too, but Paul is addressing how we should behave, how they should behave as Christians within the situation they were in at the time. So, Paul's teaching here can be applied to the employer-employee relationship, which would be more applicable to us today. I failed to mention, and I do have a slide later on. It's the last slide, I think, this morning. This idea of slaves and masters, servants and masters, it's perfect that we're closing the class with Philemon, because that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. If you're familiar with Philemon, that's a good picture of what this relationship we're talking about between servants, slaves, and masters, Christian slaves and masters, how that relationship is supposed to work. And we'll cover that the very last class of this quarter. So that's a nice thing to tie in with what we're talking about here. So Paul's teaching here can be applied to our lives today in the employer-employee relationship. Unless you're self-employed, not having anybody work for you, just by yourself, most of all of us have a job or have worked a job in which we have a boss, or maybe we were the boss at some point in time, and understand that relationship. As I mentioned at the beginning of class, this is a very common, all of these things that we're covering the past few classes are common situations, common parts of our lives that we experience every day. And we're learning here from Paul how we should behave in these situations. So, servants or employees, as we apply it today, are to be obedient with fear and trembling. Moving forward in my slides so I can get my notes. So obedience out of respect for our employer, just as we respect Christ. We should follow what our boss says, obviously. I mean, we can all understand that if you're not respecting your boss, there's probably going to be problems that come from that. You probably get fired eventually. But as we respect Christ, we should also respect our employer, whoever we're working for. Our ability to lead others to Christ is more effective by being submissive in our work than by being rebellious and unwilling to listen to and follow instruction. If we're working a job and I'm constantly doing what my boss says not to do, if I'm constantly arguing with my boss, if I'm constantly going against what my boss says, but I say that I'm a Christian and I go to worship and I follow God's word, that the boss is going to be, well, you're not doing a good job. That's just not going to work. Those examples aren't going to work together. We should be obviously more submissive in our work and listen and follow what we're supposed to do in our jobs, because that's a good example of how we are as Christians, following Christ and following His instruction. Obviously, I'm not saying to not to have a healthy conversation with a employer about something you disagree with. That's one thing, but outward rebellion and outward just disrespect, maybe it's not going to lead people to Christ. That's not going to be a good example. Work dependably, honestly, and cheerfully, even when not being watched by someone. I like to tell kids in my class the word integrity, because that was always beaten in my head. Integrity, doing the right thing even when no one's watching. As if we're working a job, we should be doing the right thing in our job, whatever that may be, when no one's watching. Honestly, honest work, and dependable work. The same idea applies to us when we're serving God. Are we doing so wholeheartedly or only for appearance? It applies to us today here. Are we coming here for the right reasons? Are we coming to worship because that's what we are commanded to do and we're wholeheartedly following God and worshiping God? Or are we coming here to show others that we're here? Are we talking about God? Are we talking to our friends about God and saying that we go to worship and that we're Christians for appearance only, or because we're doing that wholeheartedly with the attempt to bring them to Christ? I think that's an important thing for us to remember. That we're working honestly. It's the same how we act as Christians. Are we doing that? Are we Christians honestly, dependably, even when not being watched by someone? The will of God requires fidelity and submissive obedience, following His will with fidelity all the way through completely, and being submissive in obedience. Our work ethic should be a positive reflection to on our lives as Christians. In 1 Timothy 6:1, 1 Timothy 6:1, which is another passage here in 1 Timothy that, again, talks about bondservants and masters, or slaves and masters, goes along with what we're talking about here. It says in verse 6, let all who are, chapter 6, verse 1, sorry. Did I get that right? No, I did not. Chapter 1, verse 6, I believe. Is somebody there? Is it chapter 6, verse 1? Okay, I just had a typo in my notes. Sorry. It says, let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Our work ethic should be a reflection on our lives as Christians. With goodwill, serving with a willing, cheerful, and sincere heart, because our ultimate service is to Christ. And this applies even if we disagree with our boss employer. I mentioned that earlier. And this attitude allows us to see opportunities to do good and show people the gospel of Christ. Moving on, it says there I'm going to turn back because I just lost my place. He will receive the same from the Lord. It says there in verse 8, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Any good thing we do is known and remembered by the Lord. Any good act, whether in front of people or, again, by ourselves, God sees all that we do. We understand that. And conversely, those who constantly complain and are lazy in their work will be paid what they are worth. And we will reap what we sow. Some verses here. Going to read, I think I have time to finish. I'm going to read them really quickly. This is Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. It says, do not be deceived. God is mocked, for whatever one sows, that he will also reap. Verse 17 of 1 Peter chapter 1 says, and if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. God rewards every act of faithful service done for him, regardless of a person's position or status. Which leads to, this is the second to last slide. Employers should teach employees with kindness and without threatening or intimidating. This is now directed from employers to employees. So how we act is if we're in the situation of being a boss or a head of people that are under us, we should treat, obviously, people under us with kindness, without threatening or intimidating, aggressive behavior. Employers should be fair and just in both pay and working conditions. And there is no partiality with him. We see that there in the end of verse 9, right there. There is no partiality with God. Social position, earthly rank will mean nothing to the Lord. It doesn't matter if you were the President of the United States or, work just a regular 9-to-5 job every day. It doesn't matter because we're all the same in the eyes of the Lord. We're equal. There's no partiality. So both sides of the equation should treat each other fairly and with respect. And then, again, all are equal before God. Lastly, I mentioned this a second ago, but in Ephesians chapter 6-9, we read that verse, and then we find a practical example with Philemon and Onesimus. I can't say it. Onesimus. I can't. I will say it better. I'll figure out how to say it. Does anybody know? Onesimus. Did I misspell it? I might have. I did. I put a U after the I, and it doesn't have a U after the I, does it? Onesimus. Of course, there's the one typo that I had was in a name. Or maybe you found others. I don't know. But it says, where the gospel transforms the master-servant relationship into one marked by brotherhood, dignity, and mutual accountability to Christ. So when we get to Philemon, we'll see this played out in the book, how that relationship is supposed to work between, in the example of Philemon, slave or servant and master. So we'll get there at the very last class of this quarter. Sorry I had to rush to at the end, but we finished, so we'll be on track to do Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 24 on Wednesday. So if you'll read that in advance, and then we'll be in Colossians next Sunday. All right, you got a minute until the bell or less. Thank you.